Hello and welcome to History in 7. I'm going to start doing some book reviews. I am going to start with books that I read in grad school and kind of return to them and see how I feel about them now. The first one I will cover is by Percy Wells Bidwell. While he was an instructor of economics at Yale, he published a book that I read in my early grad school career called Rural Economy in New England at the beginning of the 19th century. Actually, it was his dissertation, which won the John A. Porter Prize at Yale in 1913. So he began with rural, and over time he migrated to more international economic and political writing. His other books were The History of Manchester, Connecticut in 1924, The History of Agriculture in the Northern United States, 1620 to 1860, with John Falconer, first published in 1925. I guess the edition I have says 1941. And A Commercial Policy for the United Nations, 1945. And then What the Tariff Means to American Industries in 1956. I think it's interesting to know who the people are when I read their work. I keep harping on that to my students in my upper level classes. When I assign a secondary source reading, the first thing I expect them to do is figure out who the author is. Bidwell was apparently an early economic historian who worked on a regional theme for his dissertation, but whose interest expanded into foreign affairs. Bidwell based this dissertation on the 1810 census and related documents. So he was really writing about what southern New England had been like 100 years before the time he was studying it. He included descriptions of inland towns and the types of people that could be found there. I was looking for Middletown when I read the book, and he talked about Middletown and also a bunch of other places in Connecticut. He made the point of noting that in 1810, proto-businessmen were usually only able to ply their trades and do their business part of the time. Farming was their primary and their fallback occupation. Bidwell attributed the what he called the union of all trades, businesses, and professions with agriculture and the lack of a division of labor to the lack of a robust market. Quoting from The Wealth of Nations, he mentions in a footnote that, quote, no better illustration than this could be desired of the famous dictum of Adam Smith that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. End quote. The outside markets available to New England farmers in 1810 were New York, population about 100,000 at the time, the southern states, and the West Indies. The problem was getting products to the coast. The Connecticut River, Bidwell said, furnished the only means of cheap transportation through the central region of New England. Although originally navigable only as far as the falls at Enfield, Connecticut, some 65 miles above its mouth, a series of canals constructed in the years 1790 to 1810 had made possible the passage of small boats to the village of Barnet in northern Vermont, about 180 miles further. End quote. Since transportation limited access to markets, you might expect early farmers to be less interested in improvement and production in high volumes for market than their counterparts in England and Europe had been. And this was the case based on the numbers that Bidwell was able to come up with, and also in the opinions of foreign visitors and critics like Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale, who gets quoted quite a bit in Bidwell's text. Bidwell said contemporary criticisms were deserved, but he suggested that there were good reasons for the state of farming. Inefficiency in agriculture was not due to ignorance, he insisted. Land was cheap and labor was dear. Washington's explanation, he calls that. Bidwell agrees that emigration to the frontier drained New England's population and postponed intensive agriculture. But he insisted that the real cause of inefficient agriculture was the lack of a market for farm products. The expense of labor was at this time a hindrance to the growth of manufacturers also, he said. But when the market was opened through the failure of European competition during the period of the embargoes and the War of 1812, manufacturers found it profitable to employ workers even at the high wages demanded. All other stimuli to agricultural improvement, Bidwell insisted, were futile as long as the market was lacking. Between the years 1810 and 1860, such a population arose in the manufacturing cities and towns of New England, and the market thus created brought changes which opened up a new era to the farmers of the inland towns. Interestingly, in the final page of his appendix, discussing other causes of emigration, Bidwell said, "Some men were unable to fit into the rigid puritanical social and ecclesiastical systems. They emigrated in order to breathe freer, more unconventional atmosphere of pioneer communities." Also, while describing the Connecticut Valley, Bidwell said Middletown depended for its prosperity chiefly upon its commerce. Up to 1810, the following manufactures had been established: a rum distillery with an annual output of 600 hogsheads, a paper mill, a powder mill, and a cotton factory. Middletown, with 5,300 inhabitants, was Connecticut's third largest town in 1810, which was about the time that Samuel Ranney moved from there to Ashfield, Massachusetts, and began planting peppermint. And that is part of my story from my dissertation. Looking back on this source, which I read a little bit uncritically, I'll have to admit, when I was just beginning my graduate studies, I suspect that Bidwell leaned a little bit too heavily into the declensionist interpretation of New England farming, and maybe also took the Turner thesis about the lure and the function of the frontier a bit too seriously as well. I'll dig into it a bit more when I have some free time to see what additional information and interesting sources and possibly questionable interpretations might jump out at me a decade later. So that is my quick take on Bidwell. I hope someone finds that interesting. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.